Hola, buena tarde.
Hello, good afternoon. Hello, everyone.
Muchísimas gracias
Thank you so much for joining us in
nueva
this
sesión
new
del ciclo
session
Fotografía y
of
Exposición
our photography and exhibition series,
tendremos el
Cross
enorme
Stories.
placer
And today, of course, we
de
have the
poder
pleasure of
presentar
hearing
con una ponencia
from
de Wilkes Tucker,
Anne Wilkes Tucker,
que girará
who
en
is
torno
going
a
to
la
talk
vida
to
de
us
Nathan Lyons.
about Nathan Lyons.
Antes de presentar
And
a
before I
Wilkes Tucker,
introduce
una
Anne Wilkes Tucker,
brevísima
I'd just like to
salada
say just a
para
very few words
situar
to
un
give
poco
you a bit of
lo que es
context about
la ponencia de hoy.
today's lecture.
Sobre todo el contexto. A principios de
At the
los
beginning of the
años 60
60s
en Estados Unidos,
in the US,
un momento de
there were very few
complicado
opportunities for
publicar para
art
aquellos que
photographers
entendían la
to exhibit
fotografía
or
más como un medio de
publish
expresión y una práctica artística que como un trabajo
beyond
comercial o fotoperiodístico.
photojournalism.
Y en
And in that
este
context,
contexto se van
in the
a
US,
perfilar
there were
principalmente dos
two key
figuras
people
clave en la
that
exposición que se
were
producirá
responsible for,
al cabo de
or
pocos años con
which were
el
part of the turning point
recibo
that occurred a
sobre
few
la
years later
reconstrucción
with
artística de
the
la
increasing
fotografía
recognition of
de su
photography as an art form
institucionalización
and its
temprana. Una en la
institutionalization.
que estas dos figuras
On the one
serían John
hand, we would
Sarkowski
have
de
John
MoMA y
Sarkowski from
también
MoMA, but also
Nathan Lyons desde el
Nathan
Eastman
Lyons
House.
from the George Eastman House in
Con Sarkowski
Rochester.
estamos muy
I think we are
familiarizados
all
por
very
sus
familiar with Sarkowski and his
exposiciones,
ideas and theories and
libros y catálogos y
exhibitions
sus
and
puntos
books and
críticos y sus
catalogs
argumentos,
and
pero quizá
his
sepamos
arguments.
mucho menos de
But
la
perhaps
figura
we
de
know
Nathan Lyons
a lot less
y
about
las
Nathan
ideas y
Lyons, whose
contribuciones
ideas
que
and
cierran un claro
contributions were
contrapunto
a
a las
clear
posiciones
counterpoint
artísticas de MoMA.
to
Y
MoMA's
precisamente
position.
en este
Um,
ciclo
in
nos
this
parecía
series, we thought it
muy
would be
importante
extremely important
recordar
to
y resituar
remember him
por
and
diversos
to
motivos. Entre
share
ellos,
the knowledge,
la
amongst
importancia
other
de poder
things, because
suscitar
of the importance
discusiones
of his ideas
sobre
and
los
his
cómo
work
responder a ese momento tan
in terms of
cambiante, cómo crear una
how to
photographic
respond to that time when there were so few opportunities to disseminate the
y,
photographic culture,
y
but
también
also
cómo atender
how
precisamente
to
a una
support
joven generación que se
a
está
young generation that
a
was
través de la fotografía
expressing
tan
itself
enorme
through
y diversa,
photography
¿no?
in very
Y
heterogeneous
que
ways.
muchos de ellos no
And
gozan de la
many of
experimentación
them,
o el
of
diálogo
course,
con otros medios.
shirked from
Y en este sentido, la figura
experimentation or
de
dialogue with other media. And so Nathan Lyons' encouragement and initiatives, both as a
catálogos
curator and
de
as a
forma
teacher,
clara
had an enormous influence, not
fotógrafos
just on artists and photographers, but
paso
also on young curators, such as
Nadie mejor que
Anne
ella
Wells Tucker
para hablarnos
herself.
de
And
Nathan
really, no one
en esta
better to talk to
oportunidad.
us about Nathan
Solo
Lyons.
les
And she had a chance
recuerdo
to meet
de
with
manera
him
muy
and to
cerca
spend a
que
lot of
asistió a
time
su
with
curso
him. She
y
attended her workshop
workshop y
at the
además
Visual Studies workshop, and she's, of course, very knowledgeable of his work, and she's published
pretendían que
many
esta
articles
presentación
about him.
también
But
sirviera al
I
final
would also hope that
de su
this
intervención
presentation
para poder
would
hacer
serve
eco de la
to hear
experiencia
more
de
about
esta
her own
joven
vision
curadora
as a photography
que ha
curator,
tenido una
considering that
extensa
she's had such an
trayectoria
extensive
profesional
and
y
significant
además
professional career.
venimos
And that's why,
recomendados
once
por ella
again, we
ir enviando vuestros comentarios
do
a lo largo de la
recommend that you
ponencia.
send in questions and comments during the lecture. You don't have to wait until the end. And I'd also like to remind you that the talk will be in English and that there will be simultaneous translation. You can click on the tab at the bottom of your screen and select Spanish so that you can follow the presentation. Anne is a curator emeritus at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, where she founded the photography department in 1976, and where she has contributed to creating an extremely extensive photography collection with the acquisition of over 40,000 prints from artists from every continent. In this extensive professional background as curator, researcher, and photography historian, we could mention her research on the Czech avant-garde, the history of Japanese photography, the history of war photography, and of course also she's curated extremely important solo exhibitions by artists such as Robert Frank, Brazai, Catherine Wagner, Joel Sternfeld, Richard Misrach, Ray Metzger, and so many others. I'd also mention that as early as 1973, Anne Wilkes Tucker published The Woman's Eye, including the work of 10 female photographers, as well as this very long list of exhibitions. She's also written and published extensively as a critic, as a writer. She's contributed numerous essays to books and catalogs, many of which have received awards. Really, her list of awards is really long. I'll just mention the first and then some of the most recent. Just to give you a sense, first the National Endowment for the Arts in 1976 and a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship Award for her work on the Photo League, about which she published a book a few years later in 1987. And amongst her more recent awards, the America's Best Curator by Time Magazine in 2001, or the Curator Award of the Royal Photographic Society of London. And in between, of course, so many other awards and so much recognition. And Wilkes Tucker, it's such an honor and such a privilege having you with us today. And well, I'm looking forward to hearing your lectures. I'm sure we all are. Thank you very much for your time and your dedication.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm honored because this is an institution which I have followed and admired since its beginning. So there we go. It's all very interesting, Nathan Lyons would frequently say. This is both humor and fact, a dodge and a command. For example, Nathan used this phrase when students ask him what path they should take for their life and their art. He provided questions, but never answers. Their ideas, their values, their passions, and not his, should direct their art. Next. If you can, next slide. There we go. As you can see from this list, an extensive and diverse list of professional roles, Nathan did have all on his list of responsibilities and worked that proved that it was possible to meet the demands. He focused on interconnecting programs that would support photography and the photographers in perpetually evolving field of photography. Before the digital age, photographers were more dependent on exhibitions, preferably with catalogs and multiple venues, to find their particular audience. Educating historians and critics to write for catalogs and to review the shows further developed dialogues in the field. Acquiring prints and building archives supported the artists financially. Lastly, creating archives and print collections preserved photographs for future generations to discover. Wait, you say. These are standard practices. No, not in the 60s and mid-70s. Certainly not for photography. It was a fledgling field. After World War II, there were only a dozen American museums and a few university galleries that regularly acquired photographs and occasionally organized exhibitions. Instead of creating independent departments of photography, museum encouraged photographers in the prints and drawings department to acquire photographs. That was the practice in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Fort Worth, and San Francisco, none of which had a designated photography curator until the mid-70s or later. If you didn't live in one of those cities and you wanted to see an original work of art, photographers' only hope was for a traveling exhibition to come to their home or near, or to travel to the museums. In the 60s, we were so hungry for information to see and to learn that we would drive 5 hours from Rochester to New York City for an important photography lecture. The most important photography departments were at the Museum of Modern Art, which was created in 1940, and the George Eastman House Museum in Rochester that was founded in 1949, exclusively for collecting and promoting photography and film. The Art Institute of Chicago was the only other museum that presented continuous program of photography exhibitions during the 50s and 60s. Then in the mid-70s, a flood of photographic activity occurred in the United States. Dozens of museums began to regularly collect and exhibit photographs, to hire designated photography curators, and to establish standalone photography departments. The geographic range for new departments expanded to Los Angeles, New Orleans, Princeton, Austin, Albuquerque, Minneapolis, and Tucson. I was hired by the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 1976 to establish a photography department that now contains 40,000 photographs made on all 7 continents. Both the scale and scope of collecting increased in art institutions and private collectors. Galleries and auction houses began to sell photographs, and publishers of books and magazines began to focus on fine art photography and photographers. Thus, by the 1980s, the making, teaching, collecting, exhibiting, publishing, and marketing of photographs was increasingly common. To put Nathan Lyons's accomplishments in context, I want to focus first on the Museum of Modern Art's programs, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, when John Sarkovsky became the director of the photography department, and Nathan was curator and then assistant director at the Eastman House. There were 2 prior curators of photography at MoMA before Sarkovsky. In 1936, Beaumont Newhall, on your left, was commissioned by Alfred Barr, the director of MoMA, to create an exhibition and book on the history of photography in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of photography's invention. Newhall traveled throughout the US and Europe, gathering images and information about photographers previously unknown to him. Remember, neither Xerox nor the internet existed. So Beaumont's friend, Ansel Adams, made a small folding camera stand with lights that Newhall could pack in his suitcase and use to photograph images and sometimes whole books during his trip of discoveries. Once his return to New York, he developed the negatives and made prints, which he then studied and evaluated. The resulting book, Photography 1839-1937, was recognized by architectural historian Louis Mumford as one of the best short critical histories I know in any language. Newhall was only 29 years old when he wrote it. The book accompanied a major exhibition at MoMA that then toured to 9 other American cities. This was the beginning of MoMA's traveling exhibition program for photography. Newhall's book featured work by only 112 photographers and addressed technical innovations and evolving aesthetic practices that marked photography's history. The catalog's name was changed to the History of Photography, and revised editions were released in 1949, 1964, and 1982. It became an indispensable teaching tool for decades. In 1947, Newhall was replaced at MoMA by the photographer Edward Steichen, who remained the department's director until he hired Sarkovsky in 1962. And here, Steichen's hand is almost possessively sitting on Sarkovsky's knee. The most influential exhibition of Steichen's tenure was 1955 Family of Man, which toured the world and was seen by over 9 million people. The book is still in print. Sarkovsky, Newhall, Steichen, Lyons, like most other photography curators for this generation and the next one, began their careers as practitioners. There were no curators with PhDs in photographic history until the 1980s, except Giselle Freund's degree from the Sorbonne in the 30s. Sarkovsky came to MoMA's attention after receiving 2 Guggenheim fellowships for his photography and publishing 2 well-received monographs. He remained director of the department until 1991, gaining worldwide respect for the exhibitions, catalogs, and critical histories of photography that he produced, particularly for his eloquent and acute perceptions about the particular types of photographs that he favored. His 2 most influential early books were The Photographer's Eye, 1966, and Looking at Photographs in 1973, both of which became required reading for anyone serious about photography or even interested in art. In his introduction, Sarkovsky reminded readers that paintings were made, but photographs were taken. And he gathered into the book and exhibition a marvelous collection of photographs of the real world, or as he wrote, photographs dealing with the actual. He identified what types of photographs the photographers chose and how one or more of his 5 stipulated approaches for taking a photograph led to memorable revelations. This was a confining definition of good photographs that Sarkovsky broadened in later years. 7 years later, for looking at photographs, he chose 100 very diverse images, ranging from daguerreotype to Dwayne Michael's sequence taken in 1969. And he wrote short essays defining each picture's special place in the evolution of photography. The book is timeless and highly recommended reading. Nathan Lyons joined the staff of the Eastman House in 1957 as Director of Public Information. In 1959, he became the museum's Assistant Director and Director of Publications. He restyled Image, the Eastman House's journal, to focus on the museum's collection and on the histories of photography and film. Image and Aperture magazine were both founded in 1952 and both initially edited by the photographer Minor White, and they sought for more serious alternative articles and photographic portfolios than those featured in popular photography magazines that were dominated by the market and driven by camera sales. Lyons also began to build relationships with publishers to initiate the museum's publication program. For 2 of the early publications, he chose to gather photographers' own essays to establish their diverse visions of what photography was or might be, rather than promote his own views. The first success was finding a publisher for Edward Weston's journals, which Beaumont and Nancy Newhall had sought without success to accomplish. Lyons began building a relationship with Horizon Press, which agreed to publish 2 volumes of the daybooks of Edward Weston, edited by Nancy Newhall. Volume 1, published in 1961, contained the journals for Weston's years in Mexico. And Volume 2, published in 1966, featured the California years. In this theory-laden art world that we live in, Weston's refined vision is out of favor. Photographers might find Weston's journal more interesting when he discusses what drew him to Mexico or to the California coast, or the travails of pictures that missed his expectations, or they might identify with his experience of traveling and camping for thousands of miles to photograph America when he received a fellowship. Lyons also edited Photographers on Photography, a critical anthology published in 1966, which offered 39 essays by 23 photographers who had shaped the history of 20th century photography, and was the first such anthology to be published. The articles were selected to represent each photographer's individual philosophy and contribution to the development of contemporary photographic expression. In a cogent review, the curator Van Daren Koch noted that it pulled together sources often difficult to find and offered readers diverse concepts behind major movements in creative photography. The photographer Dawood Bey wrote that he carried a copy of this seminal book, reading and rereading it until it's dog-eared and the spine had to be taped together. Other publications conceived by Lyon included mid-career monographs with accompanying exhibitions, such as Aaron Siskin's mid-career retrospective in 1965, as well as broad surveys, such as Photography in the 20th Century, published in 1967. Lyon suggested photographs in the survey to be a visual anthology for the picture-making concerns of photographers in the 20th century. Many of the photographers were as yet unknown or little known. The range of aesthetic styles and photographic processes included in this and other exhibitions curated by Lyons were more diverse than those exhibited by Sarkovsky. For instance, Lyons included photographs that were constructed, not taken in a decisive moment, such as Ralph Eugene's Meat Yard's staged images of his masked neighbors, Betty Hahn's layered exposures on gum bichromate prints, and John Wood's montages. In 1960, Lyons was promoted to the position of assistant director and began a series of exhibitions on the work of young contemporary photographers. He gave Lee Friedlander his first solo exhibition in 1963, and 3 years later included Friedlander with Bruce Davidson, Danny Lyons, Gary Winogrand, and Dwayne Michaels in the exhibition Toward a Social Landscape. Besides featuring the individual images of the photographers, Lyons was proposing that there was a snapshot aesthetic, and its unintended break with the modernist canons had influenced each of the photographers in the exhibition, and in fact, all graphic media. Lyons further defined snapshots as an authentic picture form that was uniquely photographic, which these photographers understood. They were questioning the issues of picture content and how pictures were formulated. Winogrand's tilted frames, Lyons said, were questioning structure within the picture and how it might relate to vision. Toward a Social Landscape traveled in the US and Canada, and Lyons continued to lecture on snapshots and their impact on the field. A year later, Lyons curated The Persistence of Vision, which included works by Donald Bloomberg, Robert Heineken, Charles Gill, Ray Metzger, Jerry Uelsman, and John Wood. Those who were selected, they were each selected for their refusal as picture makers to stay within the bounds of traditional photographic order. Several of these photographers used traditional printmaking techniques or cut up and collaged their photographs. Heineken made sculpture into which he mounted photographs. Metzger ran film through the camera multiple times or printed long strips of his negatives. all of these rejected as confining the practice of a single negative, making a single image as the accepted format. The photographers in both exhibitions were breaking away from the World War II modernist canons. Please notice that 4 critically important books were published in a short period. Newhall's 1964 revision of the history of photography, as well as the second volume of Weston's Daybook, Sarkovsky's The Photographer's Eye, and Lyons' Photographer on Photography, all published in 1966. Important exhibition catalogs that were organized in the late 60s included a Dorothea Lange retrospective at MoMA, followed in 1967 by New Documents, which introduced the work of Diane Arbus and also featured photographs by Lee Friedlander and Gary Winogrand. Danny Lyons showed his photographs of the bike riders at the Art Institute in 1966 and published the book in 68. The Art Institute then showed Lyons' prison photograph series in 1969, followed by the book Conversations of the Dead in 71. Nathan Lyons opened Social Landscape and Persistent Vision. That's 10 influential exhibitions and books in 4 years. By today's publication standards, that's nothing. But in the 60s, it was a tsunami. Even as a graduate student, I could purchase almost every important fine art photography book published each year until the 80s. As we now realize, there were small percentages of women in these mid to late 20th century books and exhibitions. Roy DeCarava and Gordon Parks were the only African Americans whose works were generally included in surveys. Manuel Alvarez Bravo became the sole photographer to represent all of Latin America. Regarding Aidser, Lyons was one of the earliest U.S. curators to travel his exhibitions that he organized to Japan and to give contemporary Japanese photographers exhibitions at the Eastman House or later at the Visual Studies Workshop. Having seen Lyons' show in Japan, Japanese photographers came to Rochester to meet him and visit the Eastman House. Takeuchi Ogawa came to New York to meet Robert Frank and to photograph the city. The series New York Is was shown at the Eastman House in 1968. I hung that show as a graduate student, and 44 years later, I wrote an essay for the posthumous collection of that work in a book. In 1997, Lyons invited Noriko Fuku to present an exhibition, An Incomplete History, Women Photographers from Japan, 1864 to 1997. In the galleries of the Visual Studies Workshop, this work was shown. They also printed a catalog and toured the show, which featured photographs by Shima Ryu, who was an early pioneer of photography in Japan, with her husband, Shima Kakuko. Fuku's show was the first exposure of many of the contemporary women in the show, either in the US or even in Japan. While most curators who began their careers as fine art photographers stopped publishing and exhibiting their work when they became curators, Lyons continued to make, exhibit, and publish his photographs throughout his career as curator, educator, and founding director of the Visual Studies Workshop. Having studied with printmaker John Wood and photographer Nathan Miner White, Lyons' first photographs were abstractions of largely unrecognizable subjects and surfaces. These images were not intended to be corollaries to the actual world that Sarkovsky had touted. Works from this series were exhibited at the MoMA in the Sense of Abstraction exhibition and were published in Lyons' book, Under the Sun, The Abstract Art of Camera Vision. In the early 70s, Lyons switched his 8x10 view camera for a 35 millimeter camera and began to photograph cities rather than nature. In the 4 bodies of work he produced over the next 4 decades, he noted that the kind of physical landscape he was attracted to as a photographer is one in which people have interacted with or left some trace. But people were usually not in these images. He documented in his own way, however, what people created, destroyed, or abandoned. Lyons' analysis and regard for the disconcerting juxtapositions of snapshots also influenced his 35mm work. He published his first major book, Notations and Passage, in 1974. It was the first instance of Lyons exploring the extended meaning forged in making diptychs or even larger sequences. This is a concept he first considered in reading Moholy-Naj's book, Vision and Motion, in which Moholy identified the photographic series as the logical culmination of photography. Lyons also evolved his skills organizing sequences in the discussion groups with Minor White. Lyons produced 4 books between 1974 and 2013, in which his photographs exist as documents and metaphors. But as he worked, he ceased to value the documentary status. What he saw in the storefront windows, blank signs, billboards with graffiti obliterating the original message, had something to do, he said, with a public lack of communication, the silences, the things that were not being said. These 2 chairs evoked the gender of their absent owners. In 2010, Lyons shocked those who had followed his work for 60 years by switching to color. Also, he no longer titled or dated, which he regarded as distracting information. Instead, he wanted viewers to look carefully at individual images and at their context, using the book's sequence to convey, revise, and expose meaning. Lyons referred to that practice as a way to develop visual literacy. He extended use of diptychs as well as the longer sequences, moved further away from the decisive moment mentality. He was committed to complex, evolving meanings rather than the frozen interpretations often assigned to single iconic photographs. The photographer Mark Klett said that he pored over Notations and Passage while a graduate student to grasp the visual dialogues between the pictures. Lyons wanted us to see photographs not as single images, but in bigger context. Like the poet that he originally studied to be, Lyons respected words and understood context as critical to meaning. Nor did he forget the critical dialogue of forms, tonalities, and textures mastered in his early abstractions. Over the decades, he intensified the level on which the pictures worked internally and in sequence. The New York Times critic Vicki Goldberg noted that Lyons's photographs were little apertures of offbeat moments that, when sequenced, add up to more than the sum of their parts. In 1969, Lyons resigned from the Eastman House in a policy dispute with the trustees. The year before, he had initiated a graduate program in photographic studies in partnership with the State University of New York, Buffalo. Dozens of new graduate students were scheduled to arrive shortly after his resignation. These are pictures of Eastman House as it was when Lyons abruptly left his job. And on the right is Jim Stone's photograph of Lyons returning for the first time after 15 years. During those 15 years, Lyons was working first across the street from the Eastman House, or later, just a few blocks away. On the left, Lyons is working through the factory space he immediately rented to create a school. All the students were to arrive early to participate in cleaning the space, painting, and designated where to locate classrooms, exhibition spaces, and dark rooms. I was one of those graduate students. This became the Visual Studies workshop with a master's degree offered by the State University of New York, Buffalo. On the right is a vacant school building that Lyons subsequently purchased that now contains exhibition galleries, the Artist Book Press, bookstore, auditorium, archives, library, prints, film, and video storage. Lyons combined the standard programs that define a museum with the responsibilities of an educational institution. But within the small, dedicated staff, financial obligations that were never secure, and an earned reputation for its graduates, making serious contributions to whatever field they chose. The workshop's mission was, and is today, to support makers and interpreters of images through education, publications, exhibitions, and collections. In the next 5 decades of its existence, the VSW has hosted lectures and exhibitions by many influential photographers, critics, and historians. Its guest lectures have included speakers such as the French photographer Gisèle Freund, whom I mentioned created the first PhD in photographic history. The Lyons family kitchen was also an unofficial classroom. This group is gathered to meet with the photographer Iko Hosoi, who is the second one on the right. Kenda North, Alex Sweetman, and Lionel Suntop were all graduate students. Of the 2 people at the table, each named Les Grims, the male taught photography at SUNY Buffalo. The sessions at the kitchen table often extended well into the night, complicating the life of Nathan's wife, Joan, who also worked at the VSW and was raising 3 children and a practicing artist. As critical thinking was part of the curricula, A.D. Coleman was another valuable guest, having been a critic first at the Village Voice and later at the New York Times. Those who wanted to become critics or historians also had the opportunity to work on issues of the VSW journal Afterimage, and potentially to contribute articles. Afterimage was printed at the VSW. In 2017, VSW received a grant from the National Preservation Foundation to preserve About Us, a 16 film made in 1972 by the VSW students and visiting artist Robert Frank on the right. The 35 film was written, directed, and edited collaboratively with Frank and the 6 students during a 3-month workshop at the VSW. For students and for the public, Lyons and staff slowly acquired essential books, catalogs, magazines through gifts and purchases with funds that became available. The bookstore is a source of revenue, but also features the independent artist books created at the workshop. On the left is the film archives, which includes 10,000 films and independent videos. 16 films are mostly industrial, educational, and documentary films. The photographs and print collection contains 15,000 original photographs or photomechanical prints made by 2,200 known photographers, and more than 600,000 examples of vernacular or anonymous images in the form of stereo cards, snapshots, and postcards. The collection also includes the archives of photographers Barbara Blondeau, Alice Wells, Michael Bishop, and Cyril Leblow, and the American illustrator and photographer Largen Hiller, who was especially known for his dramatically saved tableaus. The collection, reflects Lyons's conviction that students of all disciplines should not only study fine art photographs, but also vernacular work in order to better question what are presumed to be inherently photographic concepts and structures and their origins. This is an abbreviated list of people who worked for Nathan Lyons at the Eastman House or are graduates of the VSW, who held or now hold significant positions as curators and directors of American museums. All of them credit Lyons with having major impact in their future careers. So you have Adam Weinberg at the Whitney Museum, Harold Jones, who was both the founding director of Light Gallery and the founding director of the Center for Creative Photography, Charlie Stenbach in Florida, myself in Houston, and Charles Desmarais, who was director of the Laguna Gloria Museum, director of the Contemporary Art Center in Seattle, the associate director of the Brooklyn Museum, and recently retired as art critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. The VSW Press, with their Groucho Marx imitations, was founded by Joan Lyons in 1971 and is now named the Joan Lyons Press for Independent Artist Books. It has been the foundation for the field of artist books through consistently publishing books by artists and providing resources for criticism. Nathan and Joan founded the press to give artists a place to print their own independent artist books and produce work without commercial supervision or pressures. Joan also edited the first anthology of critical essays and sources on the field of artist books, which was published in 1984. She then edited Artist Books, the Visual Study Workshop Press, 1971 to 2008, and annotated bibliography with statements by many of the author artists that the workshop had worked with. Two examples of recently published books are this book titled 2002 456 111 by Jason Lazares with Martha Rossler. Noor Batik's book, Move On with Your Sad, Empty, Childless Life. Having begun with a list of Nathan's roles in the field and discussed many of his contributions to the field of photography, but not all his contributions, I will end on less serious moments. Many of you will recognize the image on the left as a card from Mike Mandel's photo trading card series in 1975. The middle photograph includes 5 photography curators: Arthur Ullman from the San Diego Museum of Photography, Roy Flukinger from the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, Nathan, John Zarkowski, and David Travis from the Art Institute of Chicago. I can report that Lyons won the game by bowling 7 straight strikes. The last image is more satire. Lyons is holding a sign declaring himself to be a sage, a wise man, while points to a blackboard, which is presumably Lyons has written. It seems to me that the right image is the end to a lecture called It's All Very Interesting. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Anne. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this wonderful lecture on such a fascinating and diverse figure. I'd like to very briefly remind you of some of the highlights of the lecture as a reminder to our listeners and as a way to stimulate the discussion. We've already received a couple of questions. First of all, about the importance, as you explained, that Nathan assigned not just to his own vision, but also to the vision and the perspective of the photographers themselves. And that's why a book like Photographers on Photography was so groundbreaking back in 1966, but also, and above all, the importance of all those exhibitions which he curated at the George Eastman House, where he included so many different types of photography with, there's a bit of noise in the background, I apologize, says Marta, but certainly his teacher John Wood, who trained with Mahauli Nash in Chicago, was definitely an important influence there in opening his eye to so many diverse approaches, and the importance of promoting younger artists, including that first Friedlander exhibition, as you mentioned, and also the importance in his own work of sequences, also his ideas on snapshot and how they challenged the canon of photography at the time. So maybe to start this discussion, I'd like to hear a little bit about your work as curator, but first I'd like to ask you a few things about Nathan Lyons. And the first question is, can you tell us a little bit more about his work as a curator? Because that's really the topic of this series of lectures, but mostly because his based on his personality and his beliefs, the exhibitions that he curated at the George Eastman House were really very provocative for such a conservative institution. And so I'd really like to hear a bit more about your own experiences also there at the George Eastman House, when you met Nathan Lyons, when you saw him set up those exhibitions. How did he reconcile that interest in sequences and montages, for instance, on stage photographs and so on in the exhibitions?
Nathan had many extraordinary qualities. One of them was an awesome memory of images. He could look at a photographer's portfolio and 3 years later go back to a picture he had seen and how it now related to their new work. And he also was so open to the possibilities of what each photographer might be trying to do, and where they might be opening up a new discussion in the field. He was tough. If he thought you were making nonsense, he might not spend as much time with you, or he might not be as demanding with you. But you knew when you had disappointed him. There were certain expressions that told you weren't there yet. But it was a learning experience to watch him hang a show. It's something we all do. It's something every curator does. But for me, as a young person in the field, to watch him lay out photographs, pick them up, put them next to each other, move them around, especially if it was a group show or a large survey, he wanted there to be a dialogue on the wall between the pictures. So in many ways, he was also demanding a lot of the audiences. He expected them to take the time not only to look at the individual images, but to give the curator credit for having set up a dialogue that that they could learn from. He was not just a photo historian. He read philosophers. He was very aware of the visual literacy field, and actually was partly responsible for the foundation of visual literacy. Actually, he was responsible for the foundation of 3 organizations, all of which had to do with founding an organization that would bring people in the field together that had something to share. One was for teachers, and he was responsible for founding the Society for Photographic Education. One was for curators, and he was responsible for founding the organization known as Oracle, where curators from around the world meet. And he was encouraging to the foundation of the visual literacy. So he wanted not only for him to have a personal dialogue around his kitchen table, one-on-one with photographers, but he wanted the field to talk among themselves, to share, to build dialogues, to be aware of what kind of images each other were making. That was all important to him.
En cierto modo es...
And in a way, his work at the George Eastman House was, I would say, very brilliant, but also, and very intense, but also relatively brief. And then, well, I think, of course, he was such a visionary on such things as the identification of themes that were being explored for the first time by many artists, many photographers, like the new landscapes, the new urbanisms that he tried to incorporate in towards a social landscape, with some very advanced ideas, really, with respect to the changes that were happening in landscape photography, which obviously then became the foundations for new topographics. So, and also the way in which he presented multimedia installations and the interest, as you've just mentioned, in establishing a dialogue with the audience. So really, he was a very, very creative and groundbreaking curator in so many ways. I get the feeling, at least from my perspective, that perhaps when he then moved to the visual studies workshop, even though exhibitions were still being curated there, his curatorial focus decreased. He focused more on education. And so that meant we saw less of a talent, which was at its peak, I would have said. So I get the feeling that really leaving George Eastman House was a rupture in a curatorial career, which had been fascinating.
Yes, I mean, you're right. But I also think, and I think because he wasn't producing big scale exhibitions, and because, Sarkovsky was in New York and he was in Rochester. That was a difference too. But anyway, he didn't make big exhibitions, but he hired people to be curators at the workshop, and then worked with him. For instance, my Photo League exhibition was organized by the workshop and traveled widely to Canada and to ICP in New York. The then curator of photography at the workshop traveled with the show to make sure that everything went well, and so he and that curator, Charlie Standback, has now moved on to his own and runs his own program in Florida. So working for Nathan, whether you were working as an editor at Afterimage, or you were working as the curator, or you were working at the press, was a training ground for a whole generation. I didn't mention the graduate students that went on to become like photo editors at Time, or in many other professions. So yes, you're right. He was no longer organizing exhibitions, but he did nurture many others who went on to do really important shows. Certainly Adam Weinberg's show at the Walker, which was one of his first jobs, were important exhibitions. Adam is now director of the Whitney, and he lets other curators do the show. So it's a process that, you do it, and then you train others to do it, and then they train others to do it. It's the way that ideas are transmitted in the doing.
Okay, thank you. I would like to, quería...
And now I'd like to ask you one of the questions that have come in from our audience, and then perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your own work as a curator. And tell us perhaps about some of those, the highlights of your career as a curator. But first, I'd like to ask you a question from one of our viewers who's saying, in the US, formalism, which began with Stiglitz, lasted a lot longer than in Europe, all the way to the 70s. That symbolic and metaphoric play through the idea of equivalence is a constant which only began to be questioned by authors during Lyons' time at the end of the 70s. Why is it, do you think, that there was this extraordinary duration of this aesthetic current?
I might challenge you on part of that, in that Stiglitz's idea of equivalent is not really the same as Minor White talking about metaphors, or certainly not as Nathan talking about metaphors, because Stiglitz never talked about culture. He never talked about, the steerage was about something, a cultural, political thing. But that Stiglitz was modernism, and Strand and Weston, and they were a particular modernism in America was very different than modernism in Europe. And the joy of expanding ideas that comes from Moholy was very different than the tightening, refining, compressing ideas that I associate with Strand and Weston and Stieglitz. And when Moholy came to Chicago, he infused in American photography people like Harry Callahan, and then Harry Callahan's students like Ray Metzger, who were experimental. Now, what neither Lyons or Sarkovsky really investigated were the roots of conceptualism. And conceptualism really started on the West Coast with the foundation of the California CalArts School and UCLA and San Diego. In fact, Douglas Hubler told me that the ideas of conceptualism just flew over New York. They just all went from California to meet the Beschers or other European artists who were beginning to explore those ideas. And then, of course, you had the people who came out of Buffalo, like Cindy Sherman. And those separated. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that you have to contain Stieglitz as post-World War II, because the ideas of metaphors that came out after World War II were very different. Does that make sense?
Sí, sí, por supuesto.
Yes, of course it does. And now I'd like to take advantage of the few minutes that we have left to talk a little bit about your own career as a curator. Certainly a very important aspect that I'm sure that you will recognize straight away is the fact that in spite of the wonderful work that these curators, including Nathan Lyons, had been doing, there was a complete lack of recognition of the work of women artists. And you, very soon, one of your very first jobs as a curator with a book as well, was about rebalancing, I suppose, this gap. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you experienced this and what that was like.
One of the reasons although I too started as a photographer, never a good one, ever. But I got a degree as a photographer before I went to the workshop to become a historian. But one of the reasons I was attracted to photography was that it was a wide open field. And I believed then, and I still believe now, that what we don't know about the history of photography is still greater than what we do know. And that's true. It's changing. We now know much more about Africa. We now know much more about photography in Latin American countries and in Asia. That's changing, but there's still so much to learn. So I will put bringing discussions of women into that parameter, that there were only 11 women in Newhall's history of photography. I think there were 12 or 13 in Sarkovsky's Photographer's Eye. Partly it was a different in aesthetics, and partly it was just a general society not taking women seriously. I mean, Nancy Newhall had a terrible time being accepted as a photo historian, but she's a marvelous and intelligent writer. And in the first issue of Aperture, she wrote a fascinating article on the history of photo captions. And so I was just really lucky that I got to do that book in 1973 and meet those amazing women like Bernice and Lisette Modell and Laura Gilpin and, Nancy, and getting to know Nancy and Judy Dater, these strong, Bernice Abbott, there's a biography on her, but she is not generally recognized for the thinker that she was about the field. She was not only a good photographer, but she was smart about what she was doing and why. And there's a wonderful new book out by Marvin Heiferman on science photography. And Bernice has some of the most challenging essays in that book. So there's still so much more to learn, but Bernice was gay. And that was another reason she was not accepted. The same is true of Frances Benjamin Johnston. Stieglitz and Steichen would not let her join the photo secession because they could see she was gay. And so, that's a huge change in the field, the recognition of women and gay men. When I first learned in graduate school about George Platt Lyons, and I mentioned him to Beaumont actually blushed because he didn't want to talk to this, I was very Southern then, young woman about gay men. So we have so much to learn. And my career has been based on being attracted to photography and not understanding it and being challenged to understanding it. I went to Czechoslovakia. I saw Czech modernism, and we did that show, which was the first look. The same is true of Japan. I went to Japan and I saw a 20th century, a 1920s exhibition of Japanese modernism, and it just blew me away. And I came back and I talked to the director of the museum, and he said, well, bring me books. And I said, there are no books. And he said, well, let's make one. And so that's how that happened. But I will also say that I had a major rule, which is I never curated an exhibition of a culture other than my own, especially if I didn't speak the language, without a curator of that culture with me. Because, and I'll tell you a very graphic and wrenching story that supports that, which I was in Argentina and I was looking at photographs with Silvio Mangelado, who published an important photography magazine. And there was a picture of fish eggs on the beach, very beautiful. Ansel Adams, I just nodded. But Sylvia shuddered. And I said, wait a minute, why are you shuddering for this graphically beautiful picture? And she said, during the time of the disappeared, they threw live people, the military threw live people out of the plane into the Rio de Plata. So we all stopped eating fish. Well, that puts a totally different interpretation on that picture when you know when it was made and what was driving the photographer. But you can only know that by being with someone who is of the culture. So on all the major exhibitions, like Czech, like Japanese photography, and the same was true of war history. I was constantly talking to people who were in the military so that I didn't make stupid mistakes. And I think that is a problem. Liberal curators don't want to deal with the military. And they write sometimes very silly, misdirected interpretations of photographs that have, like when Sylvia was talking, that have other reasons for existing. And so you have to talk to the journalist whose feet are on the ground, as well as that. And that's been a principle that's driven me in my 50-year career, working with others. I learned that from Nathan, working with others, using the community to help everybody succeed.
Thank you, Anne. Many people are saying thanks to your insightful talk, and let me see. Yeah.
You have the written text. You can give it to anybody.
Okay. We can do it. We can
I know,
do it.
because there's a lot of information and you lose
Yes.
it when you're trying to listen to it. So you can give it to anybody.
Absolutely. Do you
Steal
want to?
at will.
Okay. Do you want to add something else?
I want to add my incredible thanks for the invitation and to working with the staff. That has been a pleasure. And I just wish, I think the idea for the series is wonderful. And it's all very exciting. I'm honored to be included.
It's all very interesting. I feel deeply touched by this lecture, and for your time and devotion. It's been a pleasure and an honor to hear you. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Quisiera
Thank you so much, everyone. I'd just like to remind you that next Tuesday, we will have another lecture with Jordana Mendelsohn. Title of her talk will be From the Page to the Wall, Exhibition Spaces for Photography in Spain in the 30s of the 20th century. So we look forward to that next Tuesday. Thank you very much, everyone. We also want to thank our technician, Cotton, and our interpreter, and Maria and Carlos from the MAFRE Foundation. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Anne, especially. Wonderful, very interesting, everything that you shared. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for many people here present. See you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Gracias a todos. Hasta el próximo martes.
Adiós.
Thank you, everyone. See you all next Tuesday. And Carlos doesn't realize he's muted.
Perdona. Hi, Anne. Carlos Goyonet here.
Yes, no.
It was great to see you and listen to you.
Thank you very much. I'm
nice.
glad. It was a challenge. She gave me a challenge to think it out.
I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. I hope to see you soon.
You
Okay.
like challenges.
Bye.
Bye. And thank you so much. Really, I appreciate so much, and I can imagine the effort for you these days. So I am very touched also about.
It was a good collaboration.
Yeah, we make a good team. Also with Maria. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank everyone for me.
I contact you soon. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Have nice rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.